Every official report ends with the same sterile conclusion. Succumb to the elements. It's the clean, manageable lie.
Everything appears in order.
Nothing is in order here.
They went looking for a quiet place. But they found a place that demands it.
Federal Park Ranger, identify yourself!
Don't speak!
Don't answer it!
And the silence answered.
Their official report says missing hikers. Every official report I file on a missing hiker ends with the same sterile conclusion: succumb to the elements. It's the clean, manageable lie we tell the world to keep the trails open and the panic down. What we don't write down are the unofficial protocols for when the park itself decides it's owed something, and a person becomes the price of keeping the balance. The bolo came through just after the morning briefing, a familiar crackle of procedure cutting through the scent of stale coffee and damp pine from the gear lockers. Dispatch to Sierra Unit, the radio squawked. Be on the lookout for 2 overdue hikers, Sector 7, Granite Ridge. Alani Reyes acknowledged the call without looking up from the topographical map spread across the main table, her finger already tracing the likely ascent route. Another pair of city folks who thought a good pair of boots was all you needed to conquer a mountain that didn't care if you lived or died. I'm assigning Carter to you for this one, Sector Chief Flores said, her voice a low counterpoint to the radio chatter. Alani finally looked up. Ben Carter stood by the door, posture ramrod straight, his uniform so new it still held the factory creases. He had the bright, earnest eyes of someone who had aced every exam at the academy and believed the wilderness operated on the same pass-fail logic. This would be his first real SAR. Understood, Chief, Alani said, her tone neutral. She gestured for Carter to come over. Let us run the gear checklist. Standard pack out, but add an extra thermal blanket and 2 days rations. Weather is turning. Carter nodded sharply, pulling out a laminated card and a dry erase marker. Yes, am. SAR Protocol 4B, Extended Duration Contingency. He began methodically checking off items as he called them out, his voice crisp and official. Primary GPS unit, check. Backup compass and map, check. Medical kit, stocked and sealed, check. Alani moved with an economy born of 15 years in these mountains. Her own pack was a controlled chaos of worn straps and familiar weight. While Carter was verifying the serial number on his radio, she slipped a small, dense pouch of coarse salt into her thigh pocket and a heavy palm-sized iron charm into a pouch on her packus belt. They weren't on any official list. The hiker's vehicle had been located at the North Fork trailhead. Flores handed Alani a Ziploc bag containing what the initial patrol had found on the dashboard: a wallet, a set of keys, and a neatly folded hiking itinerary. Alani scanned the typed document, a classic 3-day loop, ambitious but not impossible for experienced climbers. It was the attachment that made her pause. Stapled to the back was a torn piece of notebook paper, a rough, hand-drawn map of a deviation from the main trail. A single annotation written in a spidery script identified it: the silent path. A cold knot formed in Alani's stomach, an unwelcome echo of a sealed incident report from years ago. The name wasn't on any official survey, not even on the old-timers charts. It was a name you only heard in hushed warnings from people who knew what the park was before it was a park. Probably a local nickname for an unofficial shortcut, Carter offered, peering over her shoulder. Poor trail discipline. We'll stick to their filed route. It is the highest probability search grid. Alani didn't answer. She folded the paper carefully, the rough texture of the drawing a bad omen under her thumb, and slid it into her own pocket. The familiar weight of her pack settled on her shoulders, but today it felt heavier, burdened by the knowledge of what lines on a map sometimes represented. The official report would be simple, but the truth rarely was. Detouring, Alani announced, turning the heavy-duty Ranger truck off the main park road and onto a deeply rutted dirt track. The vehicle groaned in protest. "Ma'am, this route is not logged in our SAR plan," Ben Carter stated from the passenger seat, his knuckles white where he gripped the dashboard. "Deviation from the established search area requires prior authorization from the sector chief. I am checking in with a civilian asset," Alani replied. her eyes fixed on the winding path. An old-timer. Sometimes they hear things the radio doesn't, T. It was a thin excuse, but it was official sounding enough to make Ben hesitate. He fell silent, his disapproval a tangible presence in the cab. The track ended at a small, weathered cabin tucked into a stand of old-growth cedar. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney. David Chen was on his porch, sharpening an axe with slow, deliberate strokes, and he looked up as if he'd been expecting them. He was a man made of sinew and quiet, his face a map of sun and time. Alani hopped down from the truck, leaving a bewildered Ben to follow. "David," she said by way of greeting. He nodded, setting the axe aside. "Alani, Granite Ridge." It was the question. She pulled out the hand-drawn map of the silent path and handed it to him. David held it for a long moment, his thumb tracing the crude lines. A flicker of something ancient and weary passed through his eyes. "They went looking for a quiet place," he murmured. "Sometimes you find one." He looked past her at the towering peaks in the distance. "If you're going in after them, remember the courtesies. That drainage basin, it doesn't like loud noises. It hears echoes as threats. And don't go into any hollows once the sun touches the ridgeline. The air gets thick." He looked directly at Alani. "If you feel you have to leave something behind, make sure it has value, not just gear, something of yourself. Superstition and local folklore aren't actionable intelligence, ma'am," Ben interjected, his voice tight with protocol. "We're losing daylight. The official search grid is our priority." David gave Ben a long, placid look, the kind one might give a nervous colt, before turning his attention back to Alani. He handed the map back. He's not wrong about the daylight. Back in the truck, the silence was thick with Ben's frustration. "With all due respect, that was a complete waste of departmental resources and time." "Noted, Carter," Alani said, her voice flinty. They drove the rest of the way to the trailhead without speaking. 2 hours of hard hiking brought them to the hikers' last known campsite, marked precisely on their filed itinerary. The scene was utterly, chillingly wrong. A high-end two-person tent was perfectly pitched, the zipper closed tight. Next to it, a small cooking stove held a pot with a meal, half-eaten. 2 water bottles were full. There were no signs of a struggle, no ripped fabric, no overturned equipment. More unnerving, there was no indication of animal activity. No scat, no tracks, no curious scavenger having disturbed the abandoned food. It was as if the occupants had simply been erased mid-motion. Ben knelt, all business, starting his forensic assessment. No drag marks, no blood. They must have wandered off, maybe looking for a water source, got disoriented. He pointed his field tablet around, documenting the scene. "Everything appears in order." "Nothing is in order here, Ben," Alani said quietly. Her gaze was fixed on a pair of trekking poles, leaned neatly against a log. On the handle of one, a small, polished stone had been tied with a leather cord. A good luck charm, a personal token. It was an offering left in the wrong place with nothing of real value given. The park had been paid with trinkets, and it was an insult that would not go unanswered. For 6 hours they followed the book. They swept their designated grid with a meticulousness that would have made an academy instructor weep with pride. Ben Carter was a machine of procedure, calling out coordinates, marking cleared zones on his tablet, his voice a steady, professional drone against the vast indifference of the mountains. They found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no dropped piece of gear. The official search, for all its precision, was a hollow exercise. The sun began its slow dip toward the western peaks, casting long skeletal shadows across the scree fields. Alani stopped, lowering her binoculars. The frustration that had been simmering inside her all day, it finally boiled over into a cold, hard decision. She pulled the folded, hand-drawn map from her pocket. "We're rechanging course," she said, her voice flat. She pointed to a deep V in the ridgeline a half-mile to their north, an area deliberately excluded from the search plan due to its treacherous terrain. "We're heading down into that basin." Ben looked from the map to the jagged ridge, his expression a mixture of disbelief and alarm. "Ma'am, that is outside our designated sector. Jurisdictionally, we can Their camp was clean, Carter. Too clean. They didn't wander off, they were led. And this, she tapped the crude map, is the only lead we have. That is an unsubstantiated, non-standard piece of information, he argued, his voice rising. We have protocols for a reason. Ranger safety, operational integrity. We have to report in, file a request for a grid expansion. There's no time. Alani cut him off, her gaze unyielding. You heard the old man. Dante go into any hollows once the sun touches the ridgeline. We were already behind. This is my call. She turned and began walking, not waiting to see if he would follow. For a tense moment, he remained, a statue of regulation. Then, with a frustrated sigh that was lost to the wind, he jogged to catch up. The descent into the unmapped drainage basin was immediate and unsettling. The first thing to go was the wind. One moment it was whipping through the pines, and the next there was only a profound stillness. Then the bird song ceased, not gradually, but as if a switch had been flipped. The constant ambient hum of insects, the background noise of a living forest, faded into nothing. Alani felt a change in the pressure of the air against her eardrums. It was the absolute suffocating quiet of a soundproof room. This was the silent path. Ben had noticed it too. His head was on a swivel, his procedural confidence replaced by a raw animal alertness. He kept tapping his ear, as if trying to clear it. Atmospheric inversion, maybe, he whispered, and the sound was shockingly loud, a violation of the unnatural peace. Alani just shook her head and motioned for him to be quiet. She unclipped her radio. Reyes to dispatch, checking in. Status update, only a burst of harsh, cutting static answered her. The sound was obscene in the dead air. Ben fumbled for his own radio, his movements jerky. Carter to dispatch, do you copy? Radio check. Over. He thumbed the button again and again, his desperation growing with each wash of static. The green light on his unit flickered, sputtered, and then died. He stared at the inert piece of plastic in his hand, his last tangible link to the world of rules and order. Now just dead weight. Alani watched him, her expression grim. They were in a place that didn't obey the laws of physics, let alone the regulations of the National Park Service. They moved deeper into the basin, their boots making no sound on the thick carpet of moss and fallen leaves. The silence was a physical weight, pressing in from all sides. Here, the trees were ancient things, twisted and heavy with age, their branches forming a dense canopy that starved the light. Alani felt 1,000 unseen eyes on her back, the constant, dispassionate observation of a place that knew it was the alpha predator. Beside her, Ben moved with a stiff, unnatural caution, his training a poor shield against a threat he couldn't classify or comprehend. He had abandoned any attempt at verbal communication, resorting to the hand signals they used in stealth operations, a piece of procedural absurdity in this suffocating stillness. In the center of a small, unnaturally clear glade stood a pillar of rock. It was not the familiar gray granite of the surrounding peaks, but a column of dark, almost black stone that seemed to drink the meager light. It rose a dozen feet from the forest floor, its surface slick and patterned with a pale, leprous lichen Alani had never seen before. It wasn't on any geological survey, a rock formation like this, an obvious landmark would have been noted. It felt older than the mountains themselves, an unwelcome intrusion from a different time. Resting on its perfectly flat top was a small, bright orange object. Ben saw it the same time she did. He raised a hand pointing, his eyes wide. They approached slowly, circling the monolith. It was one of the missing hikers' Garmin GPS units. It was placed dead center, screen facing up, with a precision that defied accident. It hadn't been dropped or left behind, it had been presented. A trophy, a marker. Breaking from his stupor, Ben's training kicked back in. He unclipped the departmental camera from his vest. Documenting the scene, he mouthed, his voice a dry rasp he didn't dare use. He raised the camera, a modern device against an ancient backdrop, and framed the shot, the dark stone, the vibrant orange GPS, the oppressive gloom of the forest. He depressed the shutter button. There was no click. Instead, a faint, high-pitched whine emanated from the camera's body for a single second. The fully charged battery icon on the small LCD screen flashed a desperate red and then went black. The device in his hands was inert, a brick of plastic and glass. Ben stared at it, his face a mask of confusion. He popped the battery out, reseated it, and tried again. Nothing. He fumbled in his pack for a spare battery, his movements frantic now, and snapped it into place. The result was the same. The camera remained dead. For Alani, the scene snapped into a horrifyingly familiar focus. The equipment failure wasn't a random. It was a memory clawing its way out of a sealed file. 5 years ago, a geologist named Peterson in the Whispering Badlands. They'd found his high-end magnetometer placed on a twisted pillar of salt rock, looking for all the world like an offering on an altar. Every piece of electronic equipment in his kit, from his radio to his digital watch, had been drained. The official report, the one Shed signed under Sector Chief Flores S. Watchful Eye, had speculated about a unique electromagnetic field or a localized lightning event. But Flores had later handed her a thin red-stamped folder with the order to read it once and never speak of it. It contained 2 other reports, stretching back decades, describing identical scenes in that same area, a carefully placed personal item, a complete and inexplicable energy drain. It was a pattern, a calling card, a rule of engagement for a game she didn't want to play. This wasn't a place where people got lost. It was a place where people were taken, and this monolith was the receipt. Her gaze shifted from the dead camera in Ben's hands to his pale, frightened face. The immediate, crushing weight of her responsibility settled on her. She had to get him out before he learned the full price of the unshareable knowledge she carried. The last sliver of the sun bled out behind the western ridgeline, plunging the basin into a deep, bruised twilight. David Chen's warning echoed in Alana's mind, "Dawn to go into any hollows once the sun touches the ridgeline." This entire basin was a hollow, and they were trapped in its throat. A primal instinct, older than any training, screamed at her to run, but she held her ground, knowing that panic was a luxury they could not afford. The silence began to fray at the edges. It started as a faint, sibilant hiss, a sound like sand skittering across glass that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Alana's head snapped up, her senses straining. There was no wind, not a single leaf stirred on the ancient trees. Yet the sound persisted, growing in complexity, weaving itself into something that was almost, but not quite, language. It was the sound of 1,000 dry leaves whispering secrets, a chilling mimicry of human speech. Ben heard it too. He spun around, his hand hovering over the grip of his service pistol. "What is that?" he hissed, his voice cracking. "Is someone there?" The sound seemed to respond to his voice, swirling around them closer now. It was insidiously clever, shaping itself into familiar cadences, the rise and fall of a question, the soft murmur of a shared confidence, but never forming an intelligible word. It was a sound designed to pry open the human mind, to make the listener lean in and strain to understand. "Dante, speak," Alani commanded in a low, urgent tone. Dante, answer it. But Ben's composure, already worn thin by the dead radio and the drained camera, finally snapped. The procedural world he clung to had dissolved, leaving him adrift in a nightmare he couldn't rationalize. The whispering intensified, seeming to focus on him, and he took a stumbling step back, his eyes wide with terror. "Federal Park Ranger, identify yourself," he yelled, his voice a raw tear in the fabric of the unnatural quiet. With a slick, practiced motion, he drew his sidearm, the dark metal a stark, useless threat against the gathering gloom. David O'Farrendy's other warning slammed into Alani's consciousness. It hears echoes as threats. Ben's shout, a challenge thrown into the heart of the silence, was the worst possible violation. The reaction was instantaneous. The diffuse, multi-tone whispering stopped. In its place, a single, clear sound emerged directly behind Ben's left shoulder. It was a soft, inquisitive hum, the kind of sound a curious child might make, yet it carried an ancient, predatory weight. It was close, too close. Simultaneously, the twilight seemed to bleed away. The shadows beneath the trees no longer lay flat upon the ground, but appeared to deepen, to gain substance, coalescing and drawing inward toward the glade. It felt as if the night itself was turning to look at them, its attention now fully and malevolently engaged. Alani saw the muscles in Ben's back bunch as he prepared to turn and fire at the sound. A final fatal mistake. The basin had been poked, And now it was waking up, EOT. There was no time for words, no room for procedure. As Ben tensed to fire into the encroaching dark, Alani launched herself forward, not like a ranger, but like a predator. She drove her shoulder hard into his side, using his own forward momentum to send them both crashing to the mossy ground. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs and sent his pistol skittering into the gloom. Her full weight pinned him, one hand clamped firmly over his mouth, stifling the panicked cry that was about to erupt from his throat. "Do not move," she breathed, her lips next to his ear, her voice a low command that cut through his terror. The inquisitive hum was directly over them now, a vibration she could feel in her bones. The shadows in her peripheral vision writhed, no longer mere absences of light, but things with substance and a chilling, focused intent. Ben struggled beneath her, a wild animal in a trap, his eyes lifted and uncomprehending. Alani held him fast, meeting his gaze with an intensity that demanded obedience. Slowly, deliberately, she eased her weight off him, her hand remaining over his mouth. With her free hand, she reached for the items she had prepared. First, the small pouch of coarse salt. She worked the drawstring open and poured a thick, unbroken circle around them on the damp ground. Next, she unclipped the silver compass from her vest. Not the standard issue plastic one, but her grandfather's. Its housing worn smooth with a century of use. She placed it gently just outside the salt line, its needle spinning erratically, uselessly. Finally, she pulled out her wallet. Her movements were stiff, her fingers clumsy with cold and dread. She bypassed her credit cards and her ranger credentials, her thumb finding the worn edges of a faded photograph tucked into a plastic sleeve. It was a picture of her younger sister, laughing on a beach, a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy captured on film. Her sister, who she hadn't spoken to in 3 years, not since a different sealed report had put an unbridgeable canyon of experience between them. "Make sure it has value," David had said. "Something of yourself." This was more than a photograph. It was a memory, a regret, a piece of her own history. She laid the picture face up beside the compass, the image of a laughing girl, a small, fragile beacon against the oppressive darkness. With the offering complete, Alani took a slow, steadying breath. She removed her hand from Ben's mouth, trusting his paralysis to keep him silent. Looking not at any specific point in the darkness, but at the gloom itself, she spoke. Her voice was quiet, devoid of fear or challenge, imbued with a formal, almost liturgical cadence she had learned from David and the sparse, cryptic notes in the red-stamped files. "We acknowledge this territory," she stated, the words falling like stones into the immense quiet. "We are travelers who have disturbed the silence. We offer restitution for our trespass and for the noise we have made." She paused, letting the words hang in the heavy air. "We ask for passage. We leave these things of value as a token of our respect. We will take nothing from this place but ourselves." For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The hum remained, a persistent, questioning presence. The shadows still clung to the edges of the salt circle. Then slowly, perceptibly, the pressure in the air began to ease. The intense, focused hum dissolved back into the sibilant, multi-toned whispering, no longer directed at them, but seemingly turning its attention to the offering. The compass needle stopped its wild spinning and settled, pointing not north but directly at the photograph. The writhing shadows receded, pulling back into the deeper darkness beneath the trees. The immediate threat had passed. Its attention had been diverted. But Alani knew they were not forgiven, merely ignored for the moment. The feeling of being watched, of being weighed and measured by something ancient and utterly alien, remained, a cold weight on her soul. Getting out of the basin was a slow, silent ordeal. Alani led the way, navigating by the stars and the feel of the land, her compass now a useless piece of metal and memory left behind. Ben followed close behind, a ghost stripped of his procedural armor. He moved mechanically, his face a pale, blank slate in the moonlight. The silence of the forest had returned, but it was a normal quiet now, filled with the distant call of an owl and the scuttling of small creatures in the undergrowth. The oppressive, unnatural stillness was gone, its hunger sated for a time. They didn't speak, bound by a tense truce of shared trauma. They reached the trailhead well after midnight, the ranger truck, a welcome, solid piece of the ordinary world. Alani took the driver's seat, watching as Ben slumped into the passenger side, shivering despite the mild night air. The engine turning over was the loudest, most reassuring sound she had heard in hours. For the first 20 minutes of the drive down the mountain, the only sounds were the crunch of tires on gravel and Ben's ragged breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was a raw, broken thing. What? What was that? We have to report it. Everything. The whispers, the way the shadows moved. My camera. Alani kept her eyes on the winding road, her knuckles tight on the steering wheel. Here is what happened, she said, her tone calm and level, the voice of a senior ranger dictating an official report. At approximately 1800 hours, we experienced simultaneous equipment failure with both our primary and secondary communication devices, consistent with severe atmospheric interference common in these parts. At the same time, my backup compass began to malfunction, likely due to localized magnetic anomalies in the iron-rich geology of the basin. She took a breath, letting the official jargon settle in the space between them. The terrain was more disorienting than our topographical maps indicated. Given the loss of reliable navigation and communication, and with nightfall approaching, I made the command decision to terminate the search and exfiltrate the area to prevent a secondary CR incident. We will file Form 3B, recommending the search be suspended pending an aerial survey. Ben turned to stare at her, his face a mask of disbelief. Lie? You want me to lock in on a federal report? Alani, we were attacked. Those people are gone, Alani said, her voice softening slightly, but losing none of its authority. And writing down what we really saw when to bring them back. But you know what it will do? It'll get leaked. Some blogger will pick it up, and then we'll have dozens of ghost hunters and thrill seekers trying to find the silent path. More people will go missing. More people will get hurt. She glanced over at him, at the raw shock still etched on his face. Our job isn't just to find the lost, Ben. It is to protect the living, and sometimes that means protecting them from the truth. The official report, the one with the manageable explanations, is a containment protocol. It's a fence we build around places like that basin, not with wire but with words. It keeps the curious out and the rest of us safe. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the academy training warring with the visceral memory of the humming dark. He wanted to argue, to cling to the black and white world of rules he had so deeply believed in. But he had seen what lived in the gray spaces, and it had broken something inside him. He turned away, staring out the window at the dark, indifferent trees rushing past. The argument died on his lips, replaced by a quiet, shuddering acceptance. The station was quiet when they returned, bathed in the sterile hum of fluorescent lights. Alani typed up the report on her terminal, her fingers moving with detached efficiency. She used the precise clinical language she had rehearsed in the truck, building the narrative of equipment failure and prudent retreat. Brick by unremarkable brick. Beside her, Ben sat listlessly, staring at his own blank screen. When she finished, she printed 2 copies and slid one in front of him. Sign it, Ben. He picked up the pen, his hand trembling slightly, and scrawled a signature that was barely recognizable as his own. They walked into Sector Chief Maria Flores' office together. She was waiting for them, a fresh pot of coffee brewing on the credenza, a gesture of managerial support that felt deeply hollow. She took the report without a word, her eyes scanning the text. Alani watched her, looking for any flicker of doubt, any probing question. There was none. Flores' face was a practiced mask of bureaucratic calm. She lingered on the section detailing the lost equipment. 2 radios, a departmental camera, 1 compass. She tapped the page. Make sure you file the appropriate asset loss forms before your shift ends. Her gaze met Alani's for a brief, significant second. There was no question about the 4-hour gap in their radio log, no inquiry into the catastrophic, simultaneous failure of multiple electronics. There was only an unspoken understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the necessary fiction. Flores took a pen from her desk, the kind reserved for official documents, and signed the bottom of the report with a flourish. Good call pulling back, Reyes. No sense risking 2 of my own for a pair who went off itinerary. She closed the folder. I'll make the final recommendation to move them to permanent missing presumed status. The case was closed. The hikers were officially a statistic, another tragic story of underestimating the wilderness. In the weeks that followed, a change settled over Ben Carter. The bright, earnest rookie who had arrived quoting regulations was gone, replaced by a quiet, haunted man who flinched at sudden noises and stared at the tree line for too long. He did his work, but the fire was gone, his movements hesitant where they had once been precise. He and Alani never spoke of the basin. They operated around the gaping hole in their shared experience, a professional courtesy that was also a form of self-preservation. One morning, Alani saw a memo pinned to the station's main bulletin board. It was a standard personnel notice: Ranger Benjamin Carter, transfer request approved, effective in 2 weeks. His new posting was a desk job in a metropolitan unit, a concrete world of traffic control and urban park management, as far from the deep woods as he could possibly get. The reason cited was family matters. A clean, generic excuse. Alani felt a familiar pang of resignation, not sadness, but the weary acceptance of an inevitable cycle. The knowledge was a poison. For some, like her and David and Flores, it could be metabolized, compartmentalized, turned into a grim tool for survival. For others, like Ben, it was a corrosive agent that dissolved the foundations of their world. He couldn't reconcile the official map with the true territory, and so he had to leave the map behind entirely. She pulled a push pin from the board and quietly took the notice down, folding it and slipping it into her pocket before anyone else could see it. It was another small, necessary act of information control, a final professional courtesy to the man whose career had become the basin's latest quiet offering. Autumn bled into the high country, stripping the aspens of their gold and leaving behind the stark, gray skeletons of winter. Months passed. The Granite Ridge incident, with its silent basin and hollowed-out rookie, faded into the bureaucratic archives. Ben Carter's name was never mentioned. His empty locker was reassigned, and the institutional memory, by design, grew scar tissue over the wound. For Alani, the memory was not a scar, but a permanent part of her internal landscape, a quiet, cold place she learned to navigate around in the course of her daily duties. Life settled into the familiar rhythm of seasonal trail maintenance, budget reports, and the occasional lost tourist who had simply misread a map. The routine shattered on a Tuesday morning over the familiar crackle of the station's main dispatch radio. Dispatch to Sierra Unit, we have a 211 just came in. Vehicle registered to a Dr. Eris Thorne, a geologist with a university research permit, has been parked at the Dry Creek access point for 72 hours was past its filed return date. A low murmur went through the briefing room. Dry Creek was the primary entry for the Whispering Badlands. Initial patrol confirms the vehicle is locked, no signs of forced entry, the dispatcher continued, her voice clipped and professional. Subject as research itinerary notes. Geological survey, work in the salt flats and surrounding canyons. Sector chief requests a senior ranger initiate a preliminary SAR. Alani felt no jolt of surprise, only the dull, metallic taste of inevitability. The Whispering Badlands. Peterson, the geologist from 5 years ago, another academic drawn by the unique geology, deaf to the unwritten warnings. The pattern was so old, so predictable. It was a tide, and it was coming in again. Across the room, a new ranger named Miller, fresh from the academy and barely 3 weeks in, was already pulling up topographical data on a tablet. He had the same bright-eyed, razor-sharp eagerness that Ben had once possessed, a belief in data and procedure that had not yet been sandblasted away by experience. He was already plotting search grids, calculating probabilities, operating under the clean, false assumption that this was a problem that could be solved with logic. Alani stood and walked to the gear lockers, her movements measured and calm. She began to assemble her standard SR pack climbing rope, medical kit, extra rations, water purifier. The familiar weight and feel of the equipment was a comfort, a ritual of the known world. Miller came over, his tablet in hand. Mayim, based on his itinerary and the likely water sources, the highest probability sector for initial search is Grid 49er. I can be packed and ready to mobilize in 10 minutes. Alani nodded slowly, not looking at him, but at the scuffed buckles of her pack. Stand by for now, Miller. I'll take the initial survey. She shouldered her pack and walked past him to her personal footlocker at the far end of the room. She keyed in the combination, the clicks of the lock unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet station. Inside, beneath a folded thermal blanket, were the tools of her real trade. She bypassed a small flask of whiskey and a bundle of dried sage, her fingers closing around a piece of cold, heavy iron. It was a crudely forged charm, no bigger than her thumb, worn smooth and dark from years of handling. It was not decorative, it was a weight, an anchor, a piece of the mundane world to carry into places that were not. She slipped the iron charm into the same thigh pocket where she had once carried the salt. As she closed the locker, she saw Chief Flores standing in the doorway of her office. Their eyes met. Flores gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was an order, a confirmation, and a burden, all passed in one silent gesture. The Whispering Badlands had different rules than the Basin, different appetites. Different courtesies were required. Alani walked toward the door, the weight of her official gear on her back and the small, dense weight of the unofficial protocol in her pocket. The cycle had begun again. The park was hungry, and her job was to stand at the edge of the woods and try to negotiate the price. We began with the sterile, official lie written on a report, a simple explanation for an unspeakable loss. We end with the understanding that the true cost is never filed away. It is carried silently by those who guard the border between worlds. This story wasn't just about what happens when someone goes missing, but about the pieces of themselves the survivors must leave behind to maintain a fragile, cyclical peace. Thank you for walking the trail with us. Here at Silent Whispers, we believe the most important stories are the ones told in hushed tones. Alani argues that the fabricated report is a necessary fiction to protect the public. Do you believe this form of containment is ethically justified? Or does the public have a right to know the real dangers, no matter the consequences? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Until we meet again, stay safe and listen to the quiet. Next time, perhaps we'll explore the red stamp file that first taught Alani the cost of the truth and reveal just what happened in the Whispering Badlands 5 years ago.